Welcome to the second talk on Retro Philosophy and the glory that is Swansea Bay. So now you know where you are, the big question is when we are, because we finished the first video by saying that we need to bring Retro Philosophy up into the 21st century, up to date. So what I'm going to try and do in this video is run through the whole of Western civilization, finishing off with my grandfathers and fathers, to explain the great battle between words and numbers. It takes a few minutes, but suffice to say that we're now at a kind of a crossroads. The numbers are growing exponentially, science is on the ascendancy, but we need to make sense of it. We haven't moved much past, on the one hand it's a clever designer, and on the other hand it's all chance. So give this video a go and let's see where we get to. If we start off with the ancients, I think that numbers came first. 1, 2, 3. Yes, and then after that language followed, because there's a big difference between 3 sheep and 3 lions. So followed by language, followed by remarkable things. You've got the pyramids pointing up to the skies to show that Pharaoh's the way. You've got Stonehenge perfectly aligned to show the solstice, and miracles of engineering geometry. Then kind of move on to beginning of Western civilization really, and the good old ancient Greeks. And I think it was Plato who said there's always been a battle between poetry and reason, which is the poetry being Homer and a pantheon of gods, and reason being philosophy. And the Greeks based an awful lot of their philosophy on mathematics. They had Euclidean geometry, they knew there was truth in mathematics, and they came up with an awful lot of observations which are incredibly relevant today. So that was good. Then after the Greeks we came on to the ancient Romans. Emperor Constantine said we need a state religion and chose Christianity. Problem was Christianity, the Gospels, 4 very thin little books. So what did the Christians do? Well, they robbed everything else. They took the Jewish Bible, called that the Old Testament. St. Paul was a Greek, he knew all about Plato, so they put most of Plato's thoughts into it there. And you end up with a Bible which is pretty thick and pretty comprehensive. You have the Conference of Nicaea, and it becomes the creed, it becomes a definitive word, but it can't change. And that's a bad thing, because when things can't change you don't get any progress. So really there was no progress in the West for 1,000 years. But that's not to say there wasn't progress elsewhere. Remarkable Chinese civilizations, Indian civilizations. The Indians came up with the concept of base 10, that 2 can mean 2, 20, 200, 2000, depending where it is in the sequence, which revolutionized mathematics. But what I really want to focus on is Islamic civilization. That's where the torch, I think, was really carried on with enormous advances in science and philosophy. And I think there's a reason for that. It wasn't just a new religion without the restrictions of the old one, but also Muhammad was the seal of the prophets. His was the final word given from God, and you can't really translate God's word, so Islam is preached in Arabic, and Arabic became the language of the empire, and it meant that scholars from all parts were reading the same things. And if you look at this beautiful Islamic script, it's really a thing of wonder. Hundreds of years later, why did they lose the ascendancy? Well, I think it's due to the printing press. Printing press came along just a few short decades later. The Renaissance started in Italy, and the reason for that being that Arabic with its flowing script doesn't lend itself to the printing press, but Latin type scripts do. And the first person I want to talk about, Galileo Galilei, so good they named him twice. He pointed his telescope up at the skies, tracked the motion of the planets, and worked out that the Earth went round the sun. And for his troubles he got excommunicated. But I want to focus on his philosophical statement. The book of the universe is written in mathematics. Ooh, that's pretty good. You could call it coding if you like, but I think still holds sound today. So after Galileo, let's leap forward to Descartes, another superb mathematician and scientist. Cartesian geometry. Descartes was a clever old boy, and he came up with a method for solving everything, breaking it down into its component parts, testing one against the other. Problem is, that's not what Aristotle said, and the church had said that Aristotle, the philosopher, was right on everything. So old Descartes was a bit stymied. He had his method. How could he use it? Well, the one thing he could do, which the church allowed, was to prove that there was a God. So he set aside doing this, and he thought, well, what can I be certain of? What can I be absolutely sure of? And the one thing he knew was that he thought. I think, therefore I am, is the great statement of modern philosophy. That's his starting point. And then from there, well, you think right, well, I can think about God having all the perfections, yes? And I think that existence is a perfection, ergo, God exists. It's a little bit weak, that second bit. Now, I think if Descartes was alive today, he would say, well, existence is mathematically perfect, and that would be even better. But the point was that the church allowed this methodology to be published for 60 long years, and that gave it time to escape across the channel from Catholic Europe to Protestant England. The English empiricists, Hooke, Boyle, and in particular Newton, they grabbed hold of this method and got going. And Newton, his laws of motion, working out gravity, started to define a mechanical universe, one that obeyed rules, and he could see that he could predict the motions of the planets, but he didn't know who set that motion to start. And that again is another great philosophical statement. So laws of physics work both ways, but how on earth did they start? Anyway, that really was the start of the English scientific revolution, and it boomed and boomed and boomed for hundreds of years. And I'm going to whisk off now to the 19th century, and I'm see the ascendancy of mathematics. And I'm going to pick on two people. First of all, Darwin on the old Galapagos, going around, and he observed and he came up with a theory to explain the great variety of little birdies, theory of evolution. Yeah. And it wasn't too many decades later that the structure of DNA and genetic engineering all proved that theory. The other great 19th century person I want to pick on is Maxwell, the Scottish genius. His laws on the electromagnetism really revolutionised science. But in particular, coming out of that was one strange fact. And that strange fact was that nothing could go faster than the speed of light. And that strange fact was picked up by Einstein. And Einstein didn't go off and do complicated mathematics. He did a thought experiment. He thought to himself, well, if I was at a railway station, two trains going in opposite directions, both at 2 miles an hour, their relative speeds to each other are 4 miles an hour. We understand that. But what happens if they're going at 0.8, the speed of light? The relative speed can't be 1.6 the speed of light, because nothing can go faster than the speed of light. There's a puzzle for you. So he thought about it. Something has to give. And it's time. We think of time being fixed, but it's not. It's relative to where you are. And that was proven with the Apollo space missions, the watches on the astronauts' hands. From there, E equals mc squared. From there, the atomic bomb. Quite remarkable. So what you're seeing with Darwin and Einstein, and later on the quantum Copenhagen theories, is that it was philosophy that led the way to the great scientific revelations. So we kind of whizzed through all of that, and I think you can see now that at the dawn of the 20th century, science continuing to grow, but led by philosophy. And I want to bring my family in now. First of all, my two grandfathers. My paternal grandfather was a school teacher, science teacher, and so he would have gone along every day to assembly and sung along happily. But he was an atheist, which put him in a minority, and he wouldn't have made a fuss. And the same is true of my maternal grandfather. He was an engineer in the mines, living in South Wales, deeply religious society, and again, he'd gone to chapel every Sunday, but as an atheist, wouldn't have bought into it. So you can still see that the words of 2,000 years ago had a grip at the beginning of the 20th century. But that's not true for my dear old dad. My dad was a raving atheist, so came out of the Second World War, where he'd been keeping the planes in the air, and joined the heretics at Cambridge, Bertrand Russell, wrote all sorts of papers on why religion is a nonsense, that's delicately put. And you could leave it there. You could say that we're now moving into this age where the numbers are just increasing, and religious devotion is going down. But I don't want to, because my father was doing some things which I think have quite a lot of significance. The first is that after the war, he went to Manchester University. He was a great friend of Turin's, and built one of the earliest computers that's now in the Science Museum. So I think of that as the brain, if you like. His first job was in a colour photographic laboratory. He even came up with some patents on it and wrote a book on it later on in life, How the Eye Sees Colour. And I think that what that's doing is talking about the senses, how we get information from the outside world into that big old brain of ours. As a young boy, I learnt my timetable on his teaching machine. And basically you'd kind of go through it, a question would come up, 6 times 4, and if you put 20 in, you'd have to repeat it, and if you got it right, you'd carry on. So that's starting to look at how the brain learns. And then he spent the final 20 years of his life working on pattern recognition. That's pattern recognition whether it's vocal or whether it's writing or what have you. And what he was showing is that the brain uses a simple trick to interpret patterns, which doesn't use much computing power. It doesn't dot them out on a grid, a 2. It just looks at the gradients, only a few gradients, and you can recognise the 2, whatever size or shape it is. My boy Thomas, he could recognise the McDonald's sign years before he could write. So what I'm trying to say is that if you look back on my father's career, he was just at the very, very beginning of something that's enormously big. Keeping the planes in the air, starting to look at robotics, the computers, the brain, colour, the senses, how the brain learns, how the brain recognises patterns. And in the last 10 or 20 years, we've seen the most astonishing increases in all of these. You only need to look at FIFA on PlayStation to realise how these graphics and computers are coming along. So the way I want to leave this is that we've had this battle between words and numbers. At different times in history, different ones have won out. The great scientific discoveries have usually had a fair amount of philosophy based on them. But what's happening now is the science and the numbers are growing so fast, so exponentially. Soon they'll be able to do it on programs without the need of human beings. That all of this needs interpreting, this body of science. Are we going to stick with the religious model, which we've had for millennium? Are we going to stick with it's a multiverse and it's all just chance, which we've had for a few decades? Or are there alternatives? I'd like to think there could be some alternatives. So that's what this retro philosophy is all about, seeing how philosophy can interpret the scientific body of knowledge. Okay, that's about it. That was a very male's perspective. I didn't mention a single woman, so you'll be delighted to know that the next video is all about my mum and her mum, and that's looking at things from the female perspective as we start to look at the demise of religion in the South Wales valleys. Until then, I leave you with Swansea Bay. Bye bye. Bye bye.